Welcome to the session about PPP projects, and welcome to our guests, Mr. Ziad Hayek, Head of the Higher Council for Privatization and Partnership now. Mr. Nawal Moshi, Managing Partner at Moshi Law Firm. Mrs. Maya Abu Alwan Qadi, Deputy General Manager at Blum Invest Bank. And Mr. Hussein Shaitu from Construction Management Associates. If someone has still a doubt about the importance of PPP or private-public partnerships, I think this session will be conclusive in this regard. Because let's face it, the state has no more money to spend on infrastructure. Some could argue that, on the contrary, the state could have enough money if there is no corruption, if the public governance is better. If there is less useless public employees, if the burden of the electricity deficit is resolved. Well, it's possible, but there is a lot of ifs. And there is no assurance that any of them is going to happen anytime soon. But beside the money issue, and even when there was a lot of money available in the years 1990s and 2000s, our public administration was able to launch only a part of the concerned projects. And its management of these projects was very poor. Do we need to mention examples? I don't think so. And to cap it all, the Sadr Conference was very clear in putting the private sector in a leadership position, if we want to get any money through this conference. So after all these arguments, what could stop the PPP from being put on track? Well, our speakers will give their input in this regard, but clearly there is first of all the political risk, a generic term that we generally use for all non-executed projects. According to some, this risk means politicians who are benefiting from the status quo and are afraid that an outsider from the private sector might put their nose in their golden goose. You might not remember, but the general privatization law was voted in the year 2000, and two specific laws for electricity and telecom in 2002. None has been executed. So, do political factions now agree to carry on the PPP formula? Mr. Hayek could have the answer, but according to public declarations, some say yes, few no, and a third category say yes, but, or yes, provided that, which would give them leeway to assess the process. Practically, 3 projects are put so far on track for a possible PPP execution. But I prefer that Mr. Hayek gives you the details. Mr. Ziad Hayek is surely the best source for the subject, as he had an amazing international expertise for 20 years before being assigned at the head of the local PPP Higher Council. He had held leading positions in Indosuez, Salomon Brothers, Citibank, etc. According to the Higher Council website, Mr. Hayek speaks 11 languages. I was not able to verify. And that was in 2006.
I'm intrigued.
The question is, did he learn since the Lebanese political language? Anyway, since 2006 in this position, the least we can say that he is a very patient man. Mr. Hayek, it's your show, say for 15 minutes, in order to spare time for other speakers and the audience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabih.
Sorry. Good? Yes.
I'll put my phone on flight mode as well. Maybe that helps. No? يمكن هذا الميكرو.
ما بعرف أنا حطيت فلايت مود.
بونسوار وبتشكركم كثير على هالحضور عن صحيح المميز. ما كنت عارف انه رح يكون في هالقد ناس اليوم. هذا بدل على اهتمام كبير بالمجتمع اللبناني بالشيء اللي عم نعمله يلي يعني عن صحيح بيفرحني لانه من 12 سنه لما جيت على لبنان لو قلت بدنا نحكي الليله عن بي 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 بفكر ما كان اجى حدا. مع هالوقت صار في تطور بالخطاب السياسي الاقتصادي الاجتماعي اللبناني دخل عليه مفهوم عم بحكي عربي. I should speak in English maybe. Oh, sorry, I apologize. It's one of the 11 languages I speak. It is. I actually speak Arabic, and I learned the political language. It counts for two. After 30 years abroad, now I can speak Arabic well. So I just wanted to demonstrate that I could speak Arabic. But no, seriously, it's. I think we have come a long way. There's more and more acceptance of PPP. There is less discussion of privatization, which is music to my ears, because really in Lebanon there's only one sector that I think should be privatized, and that's the telecom sector. And every other sector should be more, I think in every other sector PPP is the right instrument to use. We cannot be for PPP or against PPP, just like we cannot be for privatization or against privatization. These are instruments that we use in order to, policy instruments that we use in order to improve the life of citizens, in order to improve our economic situation. So sometimes PPP is absolutely the wrong instrument to use, and sometimes it is the right instrument to use. This, we have to be pragmatic, and this is very important. And I think this is a message that should be understood more and more, because if we politicize PPP, then we will be doing that to our detriment. Our extreme detriment. I will go through some slides on PPP and on the law that we passed finally after 10 years of struggle last summer, and then we can have a conversation about this. So I will not go through the SADR slides. Let me just start out by defining PPP so that we're all on the same wavelengths. When we talk about PPP, we are not talking about a partnership in profits. We're not talking about a partnership in revenues. We're not talking about a partnership in investment. PPP is a purely private sector-driven activity. Partnership is referring to a partnership in risks. So when you do a management contract, the private sector is taking no risk, and all the risk is borne by the government. This, I tell you, is unfortunately the most common type of contract we have in Lebanon. Almost every ministry has a management contract with somebody. It is absolutely the worst, the most corrupt, the most inefficient, the type of contract that we should never adopt, because either you are a ministry and you can carry out your business, or you should not be a ministry, because then let the private sector do it. But for you to be a ministry and say, I'm going to bring a private company to do my work, this is absolutely wrong, because the private company makes all the money and you bear all the risk. The other extreme is when all the risks are transferred to the private sector. In privatization, the government's role becomes only supervisory and regulatory role, and all the risks are borne by the private sector. Now, this is very good in certain industries. In telecoms, for example, you want the private sector to bear all the risks. And technology changes so fast in telecommunication these days that there is no way that the public sector, with as many intelligent people as it may have on its payroll, there is no way that the private sector can keep up with the advancements in technology. This is why we keep suffering. Okay, we suffer. Sometimes we say we have slow internet, now we have faster internet. Okay, we have faster internet, but that's not the end all in telecoms. We lack a lot of the platforms that we need because they're expensive, because they cannot be developed for a single market, they need to be shared, on and on and on. I'm not going to go about privatization. But suffice it to say that that area, which is between privatization and concession on one side, and between management contract and leasing on the other, this is what we have defined in Lebanese law as PPP. And it involves things that, contracts that you've heard about, BOT, DBOT, ROT, ROO, BOO. And then it involves some other things that you are less used. These are financial structures. And then there are some names that are used in certain industries, like IPP in the power generation industry. An IPP can be a BOT, it can be a DBOT. So one is an industry specification, one is a financial structure. They can go hand in hand. You've heard of PSP, private sector participation, which is something that's done more in civil society. All of these things are grouped under the PPP concept. This is what people think of when they think of PPP in Lebanon. If I take a sample of 100 people, I think about 99 of people, if I ask them what is PPP, they will tell me that it's a contract between the government and a private company. And the contract here is in blue. So, but I tell them, this is not PPP. This, ladies and gentlemen, is PPP. So there's a big difference between this and this. And if you don't have the expertise to do these, then you are bound to fail. And let me tell you, we do not have a single, not one, a single successful PPP contract in Lebanon. We have had a series of PPP contracts, and they have all been either marginal failures or extreme failures. And the reason is that we have never adopted a best practice approach. Usually there's always some reasoning being given. ما رح يجوا السواح السنة إذا ما عملنا كهرباء. بقى هلا بدنا نستعجل بدنا نعمل كهرباء. لأنه السايح يلي قاعد بلندن عم بيفكر ما رح روح على لبنان، ما في كهرباء، بتنقطع دقيقتين ولا يجي هذا الجنراتور، ما رح روح على لبنان. So we create excuses to say that we have immediate needs. In reality, we don't. In reality, what we need to do is we need to plan long-term for our infrastructure. But the most important requirements of the success of PPP are transparency. Transparency is number one. Because not only in Lebanon, but around the world, people have a mistrust of government giving contracts to private companies. And therefore, transparency becomes of extreme importance, especially in a country like Lebanon, where the distrust of the private sector, of the public sector, is one of the highest, is at one of the highest levels in the world. The second thing that you need is expertise within the government. You need a team of experts that understand the complexity of what I showed you as being PPP, that is able to speak the same language as the private sector in order to negotiate those risks, because you have to take every risk and you have to mitigate it. This risk I'm going to mitigate with an escrow account. This risk I'm going to mitigate with an insurance policy. This risk I'm going to mitigate with a MEGA guarantee. This risk I'm going to mitigate by issuing a special type of instrument. I'm going to build my financing in a number of ways. And maybe I'm jumping down to financing as well because it's related. I'm not going to, it's not about, I'll give a project to this company and then this company goes and figures out how it's going to finance it. No, because I need to be involved. If I do not know what the conditions that the banks have put on this company for its financing package, I may be risking the entire project, or I may be paying more for the service that is being given me rather than paying less because this company did not know how to optimize its financial structure. Financial structuring involves debt, senior debt. It may involve mezzanine debt, and there are many types of mezzanine financing. It may involve convertibles. It may involve preferred shares. It may involve simple equity. It may involve Islamic financing. It may involve a number of structures, hedges against a number of elements. Could be hedge against currency, hedge against interest rate changes. All of these things, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, we do not have the expertise within the Lebanese government for people to handle the mitigation of these risks. And this is why it was very important in legislation to create a central entity that has that expertise. Then there's competition. But before I go to competition, because it's linked to transparency, I'll go back to transparency and say that the law has provided for a number of elements to ensure transparency. And this is why I insist all the time that everybody should insist, we all should be insisting that the law be applied in all cases. The first element of transparency is that all the stakeholders have to be consulted on the design and the implementation of the PPP tender. We cannot afford having وزارة السياحة بتعطي كونترا لشركة لتعمل مغارة تجعيتها، بعدين البلدية ما بتخليها تعمل كوفي شوب، بتسكر لها الطريق. Not acceptable. ما فينا يكون عندنا معمل نفايات بصيدا من عمره بندفع عليه و7 سنين المعمل موجود وجبل الزبالة عم بيعلى وعم بينزل بالبحر، وكل ما تشتت الدنيا ويصير في عاصفة بنقول اوف كارثة بيئية. وهيدا المعمل هونيك لأنه البلدية did not work with وزارة الأشغال لما اجت لزمت هيدا المعمل. We cannot afford to continue to do these things. So, and this is an element of transparency, not only for efficiency of the project long term, but it has to do with understanding that as any time, it does not matter how saintly you think anybody is. Every person, like Churchill said, every person has a price. Do not trust in people, trust in institutions. So therefore, trust in systems. And therefore, what you need is to make sure that several institutions, several stakeholders are looking at that document. It's not only معمل كهرباء مش بس لوزارة الطاقة، لوزارة المالية، لوزارة البيئة، لوزارة الصناعة، للبلدية، لاتحاد البلديات، لكهرباء لبنان، لمجلس الماء والأعمار. Everybody has to look at these documents. And when everybody is looking at these documents, there's no longer an address for the corrupter to go corrupt, because they don't know who, how, or it becomes too costly. You can bribe one person. You cannot bribe an entire set of administrations. And yet, what we have done in the legislation is that we have ensured that none of these stakeholders has a blocking veto on the progress of the project, because you do not want somebody to block, but you want to be able to get everybody's input, address it, and how do you say that? Document that for transparency's purposes. The second thing is, we said all the qualified companies made comment on the tender document and on the PPP contract. That ensures that every company is policing that process to make sure that the tender document and the contract are not made to measure for one of their competitors, for one company to win. The third element is that we said the PPP, the tender document has to include the PPP contract. We cannot continue to do what we're doing. نعمل مناقصة بتربحها الشركة الفلانية، بعدين بيقعد الوزير بيتفاوض معهم. على أي أساس عم بيتفاوض؟ Somebody wins a contract for a hospital for $100 million. The next day they go to see the minister. معالي الوزير إنه ضروري تحط أكسجين بكل الأوض، ما في مرضى منه بحاجة لأكسجين. 70% بكفي. That when they change that, the whole concept of the price they bid for is completely out the door. The contract has to be part of the tender document. The fourth element we put in is that there has to be a minimum of 3 bids in a tender. And these 3 bids...
Mr. Hayek,
I'm
I think
going
we're
beyond
lacking a bit of time.
It's okay,
And,
but allow me, please, because this is very important.
Yeah,
Please allow me.
Yes, of course, but we also need to make a small word about the 3 projects that you are working on now.
I will get there, but please allow me. This is very important. This is the most important thing. If I don't leave here with having drilled into everybody's head the importance of transparency, I have failed at what I'm doing. Okay, so thank you. Thank you. So so the law says that there has to be at least 3 bids, and at least 2 of them have to be technically qualified. And if there is only 1 bid that is technically qualified, you do not even open the financial envelopes. You have to redo the whole transaction from scratch. This is very important. And the 5th element is, we said that every 6 months, the company has to present a report during the term of the contract, has to present a report on how it is meeting the terms of the contract, and especially the KPIs that are in this contract. We cannot have a company that is out there doing work Ken Suklin or Ken whatever, some other company, and you don't know what they're doing. We have to have reports on how they are meeting the terms of the contract. Investor confidence, this is just to say that we have included arbitration, we have included some other things in the international arbitration, other things in the law to allow for investors to be comfortable. Now, all this detail is here. I will not go through these slides, obviously, because I'm running out of time.
I remind the old people that the old presentation will be available on YouTube and on our website, so you can do all the details that are there.
So I will touch very, very quickly on the three projects we are working on. One is the airport, the Beirut Rafiq Hariri International Airport. You can see that traffic has been growing at 7.25% CAGR in the past 10 years or so. And this is actually interesting, but let me tell you that this is not only for Lebanon. This is an international growth in traffic. We are seeing this globally. It's very important not to think that, oh my God, maybe in the next few years this will change. It may, but it has to do with a number of factors that are happening around the world. The bottom line is our current infrastructure is no longer able to service the number of passengers that the airport is having to deal with, so we need to expand it. And this is an idea for the expansion of the airport that we have retained IFC to be our overall advisor. They have retained the services of technical experts, a company by the name of ICF, with the help of SETS here in Lebanon. And on the legal side, they've retained DLA Piper with the help of Moshi law firm here in Lebanon to assist with this project. And we think we have an excellent team of advisors. And so we have started work. The idea is where you see the white building on my side, this is the existing terminal, and the green building is the first phase of the new terminal, which will be built. The project cost is estimated at around $500 million, but the technical experts we're dealing with now are telling us that we can do a lot more for a lot less. So I think this is good news. We have had a series of meetings with potential investors. I was in Hamburg last week where we met with about 11 investors that were there, plus there are some others that are visiting us here in Lebanon. They are extremely excited about this prospect. So I think this can be a very successful project. What we need now is for the government to be formed, for the government to meet, and to give us the green light to start this process. This process is estimated to take about 2 years. We're hoping to be able to award the contract the beginning of the second quarter of 2020. People ask, why does it take so long? It takes a long time to do PPP projects. This is very also important for everyone to realize. When we do a regular tender, the government has already spent years getting a loan from Kuwait. And the only thing it has to do now is to do the tender. But when we do PPP, we have to allow the private sector companies time to design the project, to price it, so that if they're building a power plant, they need to be able to do the design, a competitive design of a power plant that gives them an advantage over their competitors. And they need to hire engineers, they need to hire consultants to do this. It takes time. And after they have the design, they have to build a financial model, and they have to go to banks and negotiate financing. So if one entity for the same exact project obtains financing that's 0.25% less than the other, that entity can win a bid. So even 0.25% on the overall cost of funds can make a difference. And so they need time to negotiate with their banks. This is why it takes a long time. This is why, in part, the French failed at PPP, because one of the elements of French law was that they wanted to use PPP when there is an emergency. No, you don't use PPP when there is an emergency. You use PPP when you have time, and you need the time. The second project is the Beirut Aibe Expressway. This is a project that is in 2 segments. There's a segment of the Dubai Aibe, which has been approved by the Council of Ministers for expropriation, and the CDR is already working on that. And there's a southern segment, which is Khalid Baye, where there's no decree yet for expropriation. Now, the issue has always been everywhere expropriation. One is the cost of expropriation, the other is people objecting to expropriation. And you cannot get financing from people like the World Bank and EBRD, et cetera, unless the people are satisfied. You cannot have social unrest because of these things. So what we have come up with is really, it's like when you have a big problem, what do? You hide. So we're hiding. So we're going underground. And so we're tunneling the entire thing, more or less. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but the idea is to tunnel most of it. And I think what we've done by doing that, actually, believe it or not, at least in the northern segment, we've reduced the overall cost of the project by 8% by doing that. So, and now we're working on a study to do the southern segment. We have hopefully a report coming up in the next 2 weeks to advise us on what that would look like. The advisors are EBRD, and they have retained the help of financial advisors, MESARs, of technical advisors and legal advisors. And please, I apologize, I forget who these people are because I haven't been following up with them day to day. We have not had the kickoff meeting yet. It is planned for January. But if you write to me, I can give you the names of the companies that have been selected. We are not selecting the companies. They're being selected in this case, by EBRD. And I think we don't want anybody thinking, oh, Ziad Hayek likes these people, so he's giving them preferential treatment. The segments here that you see in blue are tunnels. The red are bridges, and the yellow are regular roads. And what we've done with this design is we've optimized the design that was originally done by Dar al-Handasa and CDR. So we kept all the exchanges in order to go up to Ajaltoun and Sahel Alma and Ghazir and Ftouh and Aibi. But we have created more tunnels. This project is longer term because of the expropriations, and we think we would be able to award the tender by summer of 2021. It will take a long time. The last project we're working on is the Lebanon Cloud data center. This will be the largest data center in the region. Today there are only such data centers in the UAE, and one is being built in Saudi Arabia. But there are no data centers like this in Egypt or Syria or Iraq or Jordan or Lebanon, of course. So we're hoping that this data center will not only service Lebanon for the Lebanon Cloud, but also can become a regional data center. The important thing is having proper fiber connections to it, and that is being worked on. This data center, at least what we've been working on this with KPMG Paris and with a consultant called Solon from Germany and the UK, and the legal advisors on it are Deckert out of London. And the initial sizing, we've been doing a lot of work with the CIO Association, with banks, with government entities, etc., is that we expect it to be about 1,600 square meters of technical space, 360 to 500 racks, would have power needs of 6 megawatts and a PUE of 1.6. These are the main criteria we're working with at this point in time. This is faster for tendering. We expect to be able to tender it by the end of next year if we have a Council of Ministers in time. There are other PPP projects in the pipeline. They're in the transport sector, in water, in wastewater, power sector, solid waste. And these are, some of them are the power sector, the Ministry of Energy is working on. The solid waste, we are waiting to have a proper solid waste strategy for the country, but we already started working with the Ministry of Environment on the hazardous waste. For the others, we are starting a study hopefully in January on the René Mawad Airport in Al Ayad, and the rest will take some time. It's not. Now I'm seeing it's not the new Said port; it's the new Saida port. But, that's it. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hayek. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions about these projects and about the whole process, and probably people will contact you at your office to get some more information for people interested in these projects. Now, for the legal matters. The legal matters are essential, of course, in PPP projects. They last for 10, 20 years or sometimes more. Well, the number of cases that were brought to the international arbitration courts by foreign companies against the Lebanese government is countless since 1994. So, what can Maitre Moushi tell us about that aspect? Mrs. Nawal Moushi is the managing partner at Badri and Salim Moushi Law Firm, one of the consultants and one of the most prominent in the country. She has acquired skills and degrees in international business, securities, investment, Islamic finance, among others, from UK, USA, and local ESA University. Your comments, Mrs. Moushi, for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So for the legal world, PPPs are like the most fascinating things you can work on. And because first they're extremely complex, as Mr. Hayek was showing, the different contracts that you have to deal with, the different aspects that you have to consider, the different fields of law that you have to actually look at and cater for are absolutely fascinating. So you have to look at public law, civil law, contracts law, corporate law, financial law, real estate law, labor law. The list is so long, I'm not going to continue with it. But it's like a dream for lawyers. No, it's actually a dream. I love it. The more complex it is, the more intellectually challenging it is. The other great thing about PPP is that, you know, the stakes are high. You're actually dealing with a public service, and you have to really be careful. So you're actually really working for a cause, which is not always the case as lawyers. Sometimes the ultimate cause is not a very high worthy one. And this one is extremely worthy because you're actually working for the Lebanese people to ensure that there's going to be a public service and that there's going to be the continuity of this public service in the entire transfer from the public sector to the private sector. So that makes it even more exciting. On the legal side, what do you do usually when you have a PPP? You usually have a dedicated PPP law, which we have and which Mr. Hayek was talking about. And our PPP law was actually enacted in 2017, and it covers three main things. It covers the process of the PPP project, which was covered in great part by Mr. Hayek. It covers also the project company, and I'll talk a little bit about the project company in a bit, and the contents of the PPP agreement, some of which was touched by Mr. Hayek. So for the process, I mean, it's two main phases that were addressed. What's interesting about the process, other than that Mr. Hayek's already said, is that it's basically a three-tier process, three parties more or less involved. The project committee, which is a committee formed by the HCP and by the relevant ministry of the sector through which the project falls, and the Ministry of Finance, and these are the people that will study the project. Then the HCP, obviously, who has to approve the project, and then the Council of Ministers. So it's basically these type of three things. And there are two main phases. So first is actually approving the project, and second, then selecting the private partner, and the details have already been given in a great deal. I'm not going to talk about process because it's not always exciting, but the most exciting part of that process is the transparency that was put in, and that's actually very positive in our PPP law. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the project company. So the PPP law talks about a project company. What is the project company? So what's going to happen is this service that was usually provided by the public party or by the government is now going to be managed, administrated, financed, and operated by the project company, by the private partner. And the law provides that this private partner must incorporate a project company. The law also tells you it has to be a Lebanese joint stock company, and it can be formed of foreign and local investors. You have the option and that's what's also extremely positive, because you will need foreign investors to deal with such large stake projects. And the government can participate in the private company according to the law. Okay, can be one of the shareholders and contribute to the capital of the project company. the project company has to be completely dedicated for the project, and that's all that it has to do. And anyway, for financing purposes, which I'm sure you'll cover afterwards, this is an essential part so that the lenders can really control their investment. What's also interesting is that the PPP law includes a limitation so that the shareholders cannot transfer their shares until the operational phase, until the operations have started. They won't be able to transfer their shares in the project company without the approval of the Council of Ministers until the operation has started. And the other good thing that the PPP law did is that the PPP law provided some exemptions for the project company. So in Lebanon, when you have a company that's doing a public service, 1/3 of the company's shares have to be held by Lebanese. They exempted the companies from doing this because this obviously is going to be a deterrent for foreign investors. And so that's one of the things that was exempted. The other thing is this requirement that the majority of the board of directors be Lebanese. This was also exempted for that company, for the PPP project company, and also the requirement for the additional auditors. Usually, I mean, you will have highly qualified international auditors for these project companies and in these types of projects. So these are some of the things that the law covers on this. On the PPP agreement itself, so what does the law say? And the law's been quite detailed on this, on what at a minimum the PPP agreement should include. So it talks about, obviously, the rights and obligation of the parties, financing, which I'm not go into details on because we'll get into that. And I don't know if you'll cover the step-in right, but that's an interesting thing that wasn't covered in the law, but that would normally be looked at in the PPP agreements. It talks about the duration, and the duration has to be set into the PPP agreement, and it should not exceed 35 years. The law put a limit of 35 years. It says that the PPP agreement must talk about the revenues to and from. So what revenues will be going to the project company from the government, and what revenues will be going to the government from the project company. All this has to be set out in your PPP agreement. It talks about setting out which fees can be actually collected on behalf of the government by the project company. The KPIs, it must include KPI, reportings, allocation of risks, which is essential and which Mr. Hayek touched on as well, which has to be included in a great deal of detail in the PPP agreements. Rules for amendments, how do you amend it? Guarantees, public asset availability. So what assets are you going to need from the public to make available for you to be able to run that public service? It's extremely important for that whole details to be really done clearly by the project team. How to ensure the continuity of the public service if you have a termination, if there is an expiry of the project agreements, or if there's a breach. Even if there's a breach, you need to ensure that there is continuity of the public service. These are essential things that you need to include in your PPP agreements. And then the dispute resolution, and again, the law did something very positive here, which is, as Mr. Hayek was saying, it included the possibility for international arbitration, local arbitration, and mediation. And so the fact that you have it by law removes an obstacle which normally under Lebanese law you would have had to have approval of Council of Ministers, and it's disputable what is exactly required for that. So the law just clarified that very quickly and made it extremely attractive for international investors. The law didn't yeah, absolutely. So what the law didn't mention, which is also important to consider, is the governing law. So what do you include as your governing law in the agreement? And so you have the flexibility to include whatever law you want, except that there are mandatory Lebanese law issues that would apply regardless of the law that you choose. So one of the very important aspects that you need to take into considerations when you do a PPP is the transfers. What are you going to transfer to the project company? And here you have, I'd say, two very delicate issues. The labor and employees. So you have to do your list of assets and your labor, which is the labor from the public sector that is actually going to move to this project company, and how you're going to move them. This is a very delicate thing and very interesting and very carefully has to be looked at. And the other thing is any other assets that you're going to have to transfer. How do you transfer all the contracts that you're going to need to continue running the service? And then the last thing is what you don't transfer but what you need. So for example, let's say you're doing a power plant, you're going to need land. This land, you're not going to transfer the land that is owned by the government to the project company. you might not and you might, but you probably won't. But you might want to make it available to the project company. And the law provides for a way to make the land available. The government can make it available throughout the duration of the project. The law also provides for expropriation. So, and what it did that's really good as well here is that it said that the expropriation can be done if it's requested by the HCP or by the project company. And in that case, it would need to be done within a process of 6 months. So it cuts it tells you, you have to have it done within 6 months. You still have to apply the expropriation laws and provide the appropriate compensation and whatever, but there's a process. It's set out that clearly in the law. So that's in short, that's all I have to say. I just want to...
what you have said are all positive evaluation of the law itself. Do you have a negative feeling about one point or another about the law? You wish there was something that does not exist actually in the law?
No, I don't at this stage, to be honest, because at this stage what the law did say is that there will be implementation decrees for anything that's not set out right now in the law. There'll be implementation decrees that will come out. So those haven't come out yet, and I don't know what they will cover when they will come out. But obviously there are going to be needed some implementation decrees to clarify how things will be transferred if it's not done in the PPP. But I think at this stage, because the process has just started, I would say that there's nothing negative to look at really, because we're well supported. It's a positive law to work with. You can obviously, if you do an analysis, you can always say, yes, we should have this, we should have that, we should have this. But I mean, it's a law you can work with and you can work with well, and I think that can attract quite a lot of international investors.
Thank you, Mr. Moshe. Thank you so much. Well, and now who is going to finance PPP projects? And what's the private sector, and it is the private side, how can they have a decent and flawless return on investment? Especially that the state, their partner, does not have a good track record in financial or management issues. Are banks ready to go through this, and on what conditions? Mrs. Maya Abu Alwan Al-Qadi, Deputy General Manager of Blum Invest Bank, could give us some answers. Mrs. Qadi, HOC graduate, has a long working experience in the investment banking, business planning, product development, business development, and we can go on and on. Your input, Mrs. Qadi, in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm representing Blum Invest Bank today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the financing options, but I was really excited to be part of this panel and to be talking from the perspective of an investment bank that makes funds available from the commercial banking side, but that is really well positioned to structure the financing solutions required for PPP projects. We've all been waiting for the law to pass. And as both Mr. Hayek and Mr. Moushi covered it, the law makes it easier for financing to be available for these projects. As an investment bank, Blum Invest Bank has different activities that we cover. It includes private banking, capital markets, investment banking, and research. And the reason I'm naming them is because all these activities give us this privileged position to work towards finding the right financing solution for PPP projects. As it has been said and well covered during the previous two interventions, PPP is a long-term agreement between the public and private sector companies where the private party delivers a public asset or service in which it assumes financial, technical, and operational risk. As a matter of fact, when the private sector participates in government infrastructure projects, it provides technical skills and know-how, but it also provides the funds, and it helps absorb part of the risk of these projects. And this is, I think, the part that's most interesting for the financing side. I would like to pick up on what Mr. Hayek and Mr. Moushi said regarding the transparency and the fact that the law was passed last year. When we compare the PPP legal framework to the traditional procurement, In general, traditional procurement lacks transparency. It does have low competitiveness. It has weak accountability standards. And providing a strong legal framework under the PPP law gives clarity and visibility to the implementation of the project. It allows the private sector to hold more stake in the delivery of the service or of the asset, and this allows financing to be available. It does mobilize finance. As any project, as it was noted by the legal intervention, the PPP agreement covers various parts of this contractual relationship between the private party and the government. This is what any financing structure looks for. It's not magic. It's a combination of equity and debt. Equity is usually provided by international investors that can be project developers, engineering or construction companies, or infrastructure management companies, but it can also be provided by private equity funds. This is why I believe that the participation of investment banks as well as commercial banks in the structuring of these private equity funds is important to make these funds available. It's not the regular traditional financing that we would be looking at. Also from the debt side, as you've covered everything, by the way, from the debt side, we can look at the regular lending, which is provided by the commercial banks as well as the international agencies that earmark funds for development projects. But we can also look at the issuance of bonds, convertibles, preferred shares that allow more people to participate in the financing of these projects. Normally, it would also make the financing less costly because it does allow access to a wider base of investors. Again, what was said but not really detailed is the risks, because any financing requires assessing the risks and looking for mitigants. Depending on the agreement, depending on the terms, the risk allocation between the government and the private sector, the risk will be assessed. Some projects end up not being bankable because the risk part that is transferred to the private party is too high. The rates would be too high, making it less feasible commercially for the private company that is taking the project. The risks might be too high for the banks or any lenders to be willing to participate. On the other hand, it's a balance because the government can contribute or can address this risk issue by guaranteeing some of the aspects of the project, but then it becomes too easy and there is no alignment between the private incentive of making profit and the government goals of rendering certain services. Of course, there are external mitigants that we can also look at when we look at the risks, which is guarantees, insurance, cross-border insurance, to cover specific risks, as you mentioned, related to the currency risk, interest rate risk, political unrest risk. And all these are available mitigants that would be looked at. But again, to conclude a little bit, I think the Lebanese banking sector is looking forward to participate in the PPP project. I think we're extremely well positioned to do that. We have a long know-how in project financing, different types of structures, long-term, short-term, everything is available in the market. We have very strong and deep ties with the private sector, so it makes it also more workable. We have regional reach, allowing us to find local as well as regional partners. But in some cases, for example, in the case of Blum Bank, our regional reach allowed us to be more familiar with PPP projects that took place in other markets. So يعني as Blum Bank, but I also think on behalf of most of the banks, I think everybody is willing to look at the different projects and assess them case by case.
Thank you.
Help
Thank you, Mrs.
advising on
Qadi.
the structure, of course.
Thank you, Mrs. Qadi. Well, Mr. Haik said, 2 of the 3 projects that are under study now are about construction. The data center, it has some construction, but mainly the 2 other ones. Well, but is this different from any infrastructure project that specialized companies perform now for the account of the government? Are contractors ready to offer themselves a long-term funding scheme like the one proposed by Mrs. Qadi and as equity? Mr. Hussein Shaito from Construction Management Associates can give us the answer. Mr. Shaito, civil engineer from the LAU, has also project management certificate and the quantity surveying certificate from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, UK. Mr. Shaito, your input in 10 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Haik, for the presentation. We at CMA, as project managers, one of our initial tasks in any project development is to identify the risks and methods to mitigate them or to avoid them. In general terms, an ideal contractual framework would allocate each risk to the party best able to handle it at the lowest cost. Thus, we create the maximum value for the money invested. Now, PPPs have their own risk profile. I will elaborate more on the different types of risks, with emphasis on those pertinent to the engineering and construction of toll roads and airports. Starting with the design risks. This includes the risk that the project has not been designed adequately for the purpose it required, delays in approval of design, and changes to the design. Ideally, this risk is assumed by the private entity, which to benefit from the private sector's innovation and expertise in the design. However, there are some factors that affect this liability. First, let's take the example of an airport. An airport is a national matter of pride. So the public entity, as the case of the expansion of the Beirut airport, may have hired a leading firm of architects to design the airport and provide outline specifications. Afterwards, the private entity would be required to adopt this outline design and develop the detailed design. So if the specifications were too prescriptive, for example, the terminal design constrains the throughput of passengers, then the public entity will, to that extent, be sharing this risk. Of course, delays in approving designs will be borne by the public entity, and liability for delays due to design changes will depend on the causes for which these design changes were occurring. This risk could be mitigated with the following measures. First, the public authority or entity should provide a broad design instead of a prescriptive one. Second, conducting a design review, a mutual one, to allow for increased cooperation between the private and the public entities. However, this review, although mutual, shall not diminish the private entity's responsibility for this design. Use of BIM models, of course, should expedite the detailed design review process. Now I move to the construction risk. This includes the risk of labor disputes, project management issues, commissioning damage, quality assurance, subcontractor disputes, and insolvency. Generally, the private entity assumes this risk. However, there are special circumstances, such as when the certain work as infrastructure is required by the private entity to be completed. Or, for example, when labor disputes or unrest is due to a national political event, in which case the public entity would retain this risk. A mitigation of the construction risk is achieved through first requiring a performance bond from the private entity, refraining from unreasonable site inspections, recognizing substantial completion as opposed to absolute completion, giving due consideration for inflation, and ensuring that the construction program has sufficient float and durations has been allocated to activities with known risks. We move now to the completion risk, which includes the delay and cost overruns. This comprises the consequences of missing the commissioning of the asset within the time and budget allocated. The private entity bears the responsibility of the delay and cost overrun because it is best placed to integrate complex civil works. This is typically managed through the engagement of an EPC contractor. These costs would generally include the loss of expected revenue, the ongoing costs of financing, construction, holding costs of other contractors, and extended site costs. Construction risk is mitigated through multiple actions. First, by implementing incentives and delay damages and the long stop date. Implement a forward test to identify if this milestone will be met through periodic program updates and other KPIs, as other commenters have mentioned. The private entity may procure insurance to compensate for the liquidated damages and loss of revenue. I'll take the example here for the toll road. One of the mitigating factors which has already been implemented is the multi-stage construction. This ensures that the private entity will begin receiving payment for its design and construction costs once a significant part of the project has been substantially completed. For example, if a section of highway has been commissioned and it's put in use, the revenues could be funded back into the project to continue the construction of the project, thus increasing the cash flow during construction and reducing the private entity's financing cost. Moving to the performance to price risk, this includes the project's ability to achieve the output specifications and the cost of so doing. Also includes the equipment becoming prematurely obsolete and expansion. Ideally, this is shared as follows. First, the private entity bears the risk of achieving the performance specifications, and the public entity is responsible for ensuring that these performance specifications are properly tailored to what the private entity can deliver. A special note on airports. Often the public entity wishes to provide for an expansion of an airport and also requires the private entity to carry on with the execution of this expansion. However, a private entity will only agree to carry out this expansion if it was economically viable, and it will be justified as it does not have to lose money or lose its ability to service the debt if the airport has been project financed. These performance to price risks are mitigated in toll roads, for example, by the private entity to require the public entity to reduce the performance requirements during the settling in period or readjustment once the toll road has stabilized. On airports, the trigger for the airport expansion should be based on upward trends in passenger numbers for a number of years, not just one or a couple of years. The expansion will need to lead to additional revenues. It will not be just an expansion for the sake of expansion. Finally, I will talk about the force majeure risk, generally abused principle. This risk is that unexpected events occur that is beyond the control of the parties, causing delays and in extreme cases prevents performance. The force majeure risks are typically shared in the sense that the party does not claim against the other for damages ensuing from this event. However, force majeure risks are, to a certain extent, of course, mitigated through project insurance for physical damage and for the loss of revenue, relaxing the performance thresholds. And if the effect of the force majeure is to reduce the revenues of the private entity, then the amount of the variable concession fee should be relatively reduced. Of course, agreements could allow for the termination of the contract if the force majeure occurs for a long period that is unacceptable to both parties. Now, having covered the engineering, construction, I will just go through the other risks, which are the initiating risks ideally borne by the public entity, including land purchase and environmental and social risks, operational risks that are generally borne by the private entity include the demand risk, maintenance, disruptive technology such as driverless cars. These driverless cars simply come and drop the passengers at the airport, then drive themselves back to home, thus creating the lost revenue of parking fees at airports. This could be one example. Resource risks, and finally financial risks, which were covered by other commenters, including not covered. You just mentioned, yes.
Definitely.
So I will also mention exchange rate and interest, insurance, inflation, political risk, regulatory change in law, and strategic risks. To conclude, so equipped with all these risk identification and mitigation tools, so why are still projects failing? In fact, project stakeholders do not always act systematically in response to risks. Trust, collaboration, and stakeholder integration are all factors which impact the project's success. While studies on trust and collaborations are scarce, my colleague at CMA, Ms. Zena Malaab, has attempted to measure the factors affecting the stakeholder integration in partnership projects at her master thesis at AUB. Utilizing AHP processes, it was concluding that the most influential factor, according to responses from industry professionals, is the contractual framework, as compared to organization structure and operating systems and procedures. However, even with that important factor, failing a real partnership with a view to align the stakeholders' interests on the project would not yield the most favorable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shaiti. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but my impression is that there are more risks in this kind of projects than in regular construction projects taken through tender, right? Exactly. So it's up to Mrs. Moushi to make it easier for you. That's it?
Because we believe that because the private sector is assuming the funding part on top of sharing part of the project risks,
Yes.
it's more risky, but apparently because we're financing the private sector, so we see it more risky than any regular procurement project where the performance and the ability to deliver at the end is at stake. Mr. Haik has a different opinion on that.
You have the other microphone too. Yes, go on. Yes.
So I just I can understand how, from a bank's perspective, they can see risk in financing the private sector, while to finance the government, it's just the sovereign rate. They buy Eurobonds, they buy treasury bills, and there's no they don't need to think further about it. But from a global perspective, there are no more risks in PPP than there are in any public procurement. The difference is that we have gotten used to ignoring the risks when it comes to public procurement. For example, build a power plant. Okay, build a power plant financed by the government. Great. And then what if it rains and the contractor delays the construction because it rained? Who is bearing that risk? It's the government, because it has financed this thing and it still does not have electricity. If the price of cement goes up, every contract in construction is going to tell you that if the price of cement goes up, the government will pay for the increase in price. The government is bearing that risk. So the thing with PPP is we are transferring some of those risks from the government to the private sector, who is now bearing them and who is now pricing them. The thing with governments is they never price these risks. They don't do the job of pricing the risks. The private sector is more methodical. They take the time to price the risks. If you look at any PPP project, the cost of financing is always going to be higher than the cost of financing of a government-procured contract. The reason is that the government borrows at the sovereign rate. The private sector borrows at a sovereign rate plus a premium. Not only that, but the private sector has to use equity, which is very expensive. So the weighted average cost of capital in a PPP project is much higher than the cost of financing for a regular contract. So you tell me, if this is the case, why on earth would anybody want to do a PPP project? Well, they want to do a PPP project because you've transferred the risks, and if you value the risks, if you do a proper analysis and you quantify the risks on the public side, and you add those to the cost of financing of the public side, you will find that actual public procurement is a lot more expensive. To give you an idea.
And the profit is higher in the PPP project than in
No.
a similar one?
No, at the contrary, no. There is no difference in profit margins because companies are always going to want to make profit, whether they are pure contractors or whether they're contractors and operators. Indeed, within an SPV, you usually have a contractor and an operator and a financier. So, but just to finish on that thing, on average, it costs 70% more to do a project via regular procurement in Lebanon than it does than the price quoted. In other words, شو بيصير? I'm going to speak in Arabic a little bit. واحد بيربح مناقصة، كلهم بكسروا أسعار ليربح، لبعدين يروح يقعد مع الوزير يقول له معاليك زبط لنا هيدي وزد لنا هيدي وعمل لنا variation order، بالأخير بيطلع مكلف 70% أكثر ما كلف. ليه؟ خلينا ما نقول إنه في فساد وكذا، يعني أنا I don't want to هيدا like I don't want to entertain that thought. معاذ الله. But normally, under normal environment, there are risks that are not priced initially, neither by the public sector nor by the contractors, and they end up facing these risks, and then they end up asking for more money. So in PPP, there's no more money from the government. The government is not taking the construction risk. شتت الدنيا ما شتت الدنيا اصطفل، انت لما بتعطيني الكهرباء بدفع لك، اذا ما اعطيتني كهرباء ما بدفع لك شيء. اذا غلي سعر البطون، غلي سعر الحديد، I do not care. It's your risk. زادت الفايدة, I do not care. You have to pay it yourself.
Okay, thank you. Now,
if you
some
allow me a
questions?
couple, just to say that to answer the question that was asked about the consultants for the road project, I want to say that
Who
it's
asked?
the lady.
Okay. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, it's
Yeah.
Mazars Global Infrastructure Finance, IMC Worldwide with Rendell Limited on the technical side, and Alan Overy and Maushi on the legal side. And I want to say that we have also asked the Transparency Association, International Transparency Association, to help us with creating, this is not in the law, this is just a pure personal initiative, to create an audit committee, civil society audit committee, that we're asking them for every project to have such an audit committee come supervise our work, make sure that we are transparent, make sure that we are fair in tendering. And I insist on this because I would like us really to regain the public trust in our public institutions. If we do not regain the public trust in our public institutions, we will forever be a failed state.
Okay, so your intervention, personal intervention, is an additional guarantee, I think, for the transparency and the proper management of the projects. Some questions? Mrs. Yeah? Microphone, please, yeah, go on. Please.
Thank you,
This one.
Nader.
Yes.
Okay, my question is for Mr. Ziad. You started off with saying that the PPP isn't always the right instrument to use. Sometimes it's the wrong instrument. When is it the right instrument to use, and when is it the wrong instrument to use? And my second question is, you mentioned that it's not always more profitable for the private sector to go into the PPP projects vis-a-vis public projects. So why would they go into these PPP projects if the risks are shared, the profits aren't that higher? Why would they do it?
Thank you for your questions. They would do it because it's part of their work, it's part of their job. I mean, you have take Lebanese companies, for example. You have Lebanese construction companies, you have Lebanese school companies like Sabis, for example, one of our best ambassadors to the world about for education. They do it because it's part of their business. You know, you cannot always get a contracting job just to build. Sometimes you have to invest a little bit of equity with an operator and a financier in order to get that business. The first part of your question, sorry, was when is it? It is the right instrument to use when your analysis of your cost-benefit analysis shows that it is better to use it than not. In other words, when you value the risks and you include the risks on top of the cost of financing, and if the PPP side is less costly, then this is the right time to go with PPP. Otherwise, you go with public procurement.
Okay. A certain type of projects that should be avoided?
No.
Electricity or?
No, there are PPPs in all types of projects, in all types of sectors. It is really a financial and legal assessment of the project. I would like to add that there's also something that I'm vice chair of. I have two other titles in PPP. I'm vice chair of the United Nations Working Party on PPP. This is global, and I'm co-president of the World Association of PPP Units. So the thing that we try to do at the UN is to promote something we call People First PPP. So these are PPP projects with social responsibility, where you have to take that angle in addition to the angle of profitability, and you determine whether to do PPP there or not.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. I guess my question is, why would an international investor choose Lebanon to invest in a PPP, which is a new project, still a pilot project, when they can actually go to, well, a sexier landscape, so to say, in Turkey? Why would that be interesting for them, especially when they're sort of testing the grounds with the government now?
Okay, do investors that you generally meet have confidence they want? Do you see some will to go to PP projects in Lebanon?
Investors have their pick. They can choose any country in the world, and so countries are in general competing for that financing and for that investment. The World Bank estimates that over the next, between now and 2025, there is a deficit of infrastructure financing in the world of $30 trillion. So yes, you can cough at that. It's an amazing number, $30 trillion. And we are all, as countries, competing for those funds. They are going to come to the countries that have the best legal frameworks, to the countries that show the best opportunities, the most security and safety, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the PPP law that we've enacted in Lebanon is one of the best laws in the world. And I think that the structure of the PPP unit that we have, which is interministerial, as opposed to other countries where they've put the PPP unit within the Ministry of Finance, is also one of the best practices. Now, it remains that we have the risk Lebanon, the risk of politics in Lebanon, and there's the risk of war and everything like that. But I think investors are smart enough to realize that there are more hurricanes that hit Florida every year and do cause much more destruction than any Israeli invasion of Lebanon has ever done. So you have to not think about it from a Lebanese-centric perspective. You have to think about it from a global perspective.
And you price it.
And you price it, and you price that risk.
And through your initial contacts, did you feel that there is a will from you spoken about Germany? You were in Germany, and
I was just at an airport conference. It's a conference of airport investors.
yes, and you felt that there is a
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest.
Okay, thank you. Others, please, sir.
Yes, as far as project inceptions are concerned, when it comes to construction projects or what have you, would the government give the land like other countries, like for example, in I know in Iraq or in PPP in Iraq or any other country like that, countries بتساهم in giving a piece of land like in construction projects or power plants. This is one part. And number two, part of the PPP would be profit sharing as far as the profit part or the revenue sharing percentage-wise.
Okay, the answer is yes. The government will make available land. It is usually the most cost-effective contribution that the government can make to a project. You have to realize that if we are not providing the land, somebody has to either buy the land or they have to lease it. And if they buy it or lease it, there's an additional cost, which you, the government, end up paying anyway, because you have to pay for that service. It's then factored within the overall cost of the project. If you use your own land, typically you can have a better cost of project overall. The second part of your question regarding profit and revenue sharing, it is project by project. It's how you structure the project. For example, the Queen Alia Airport in Jordan was bid on the basis of revenue sharing, how much revenue you give to the government. We may bid the Beirut Airport on the same basis. We may not. It depends on the type. I mean, the project specificities, which kind of investors are participating, and the market. Let's say the market. For example, our duty-free area in Lebanon is much more profitable than most duty-free areas in the world. So that will create a different type of dynamic when you decide, are you sharing revenues, are you sharing profits? Are there limits? Do you have an availability payment, which is a minimum return to the investor, but after a certain profit, then a profit sharing kicks in? It's project by project.
Yes, of course, it's as we saw that it is a complicated issue, a complicated process anyway, and you need to spend 12 years at the PPP Higher Council just to understand all the process. Lady?
كيف بدي أسأل الشغل اللي عم ينعمل الادفايزري work that IFC is providing. أول شيء economics تبع البروجكت. Would it be consulted مع financing يعني parties يعني ultimate financing parties يعني بتتغير الستركتشر تبع البروجكت أو تبع الإيكونومكس أو تبع البروفيت شيرينج حسب البنكابيليتي تبع البروجكت. وتو هل عم ينعمل نوع من شوية involvement لل local banks at least ك يعني يمكن هن ما عندهم الفاينانشال capacities يمكن أو technical capacities
Mrs. Qadi will answer this part. Yes, Ms. Qadi. Yes.
لا أنا I'm addressing it to Mr. حايك لأنه he's more يعني in touch with investors and with IFC and with the structuring يعني entities. قولي لي رأيك بالآخر.
Mr. حايك, please.
لأنه كمان an international investor maybe إذا البروفايل تبعه international إذا ما عمل teaming مع local يمكن يكون أكتر interested ياخد guarantees from outside وياخد advisory from outside.
Thank you.
شو بتشوف الرول تبع local banks؟
The question is clear. Mr. حايك, then Mrs. Qadi.
The way this works is the financial advisor, like in this case the IFC, for example, is going to use their expertise and their knowledge of the international environment and the local environment to come up with a suggested financial structure. But obviously at the end of the day, every bidder, every consortium that is bidding is going to determine what is their own financial structure, who they are going to deal with. We cannot oblige people to say, you know, you have to deal with this company or that type of bank or whatever. Typically, you're absolutely right. International investors like to reduce their risk, or they feel they can manage the risk better if they have a local partner. That's what we have seen, for example, with advisors. In the case of every international advisor, they have chosen to work with a local law firm or a local engineering firm, and that is because they feel they need a bit of local know-how. I think it will be the same in the case of financing. I think the Lebanese banks will have a certain portion. The larger portion is likely to come from like the World Bank and EBRD and multilateral agencies, which are going to be able to provide more competitive financing at this stage, or at least some part of it will be concessional financing through CEDR. There's another part which is usually an A and B loan structures that the IFC does. So there's an A structure that is less risky, and there's a B structure that is perhaps more risky but taken on by more local banks, etc., that can make more profit. I don't want to enter into a lot of detail, but yes, it is doable. There might be some Islamic financing as well thrown into the mix.
Mrs. Qadi, anything to add?
Just to confirm, it's usually Lebanese banks have extremely good contacts with the international agencies and the international banks. We've had these types of, for procurement type transactions that were up to a certain size, where the international bank, when you have an international company bidding for a project, they look to partner with local banks, and this has been done in the past. We keep on doing it. We have hybrid structures where there is risk sharing with international agencies as well as international commercial banks. And this is the structure everybody likes, because you would like to have a local partner who has more local know-how. So I do think it's both.
Yeah. Thank you. Last two questions, please. Yes.
Yes, I would like to ask about one of the projects which is on PPP. It's interim storage. So if we do a risk assessment for this project, it looks very good. There is one specific risk which is not very common, which is law enforcement by the waste generator. That means now any waste generator of hazardous waste generator can dispose the waste in the river, in the sea, in the valley, anywhere. Why this waste generator is going to come to me, for example, and pay for this waste? So the risk here is that the Ministry of Environment is not enforcing the law properly, so they are leaving the waste generator doing whatever they want.
I think there is, yes, you're sure. Well, we heard the question and your intervention. He will answer, but I think there's very, very specific questions which goes into details of one single project. Do we have a general opinion, Mr. Hayek, about projects this kind, without going into the technical details of the project that interest? Perhaps a one-to-one talk could be very beneficial afterwards.
I would very much appreciate doing that, because frankly I didn't understand the question.
Yes, one-to-one talk, it would be more beneficial, because other people might not be interested.
If you can say it in Arabic, maybe I would, because the waste generator, I didn't know who that is. What is the...
Okay, so it's okay, please. Please, sir. Please, sir.
Now they are throwing this waste in the valley.
Yeah.
Why they are going to come to you and dispose the waste by you if they can do it for free?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I understand the question. I will answer it quickly.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying it. You're absolutely right. There needs to be enforcement. It is enforcement in this particular case is the name of the game, and we have to have an environmental police. Otherwise, we're going to get nowhere. Whether PPP or not PPP, it has nothing to do with the type of structure of the project, whether it's normal procurement or PPP. It's not the point. The point is you need enforcement.
Thank you. Last question, please. Any? Last? Yes. Yes. Sir?
Actually, I have one comment. Maybe Mr. Hay can also just clarify on the question. The comment is that I quickly just slightly heard one of the risks that I believe are very important in PPP projects, which are the environmental and social risks. investors want, and it's linked actually even to what Mr. Aboud is saying. So investors won't come and invest if the environmental or social risk is high, or if a project doesn't have a social license to operate. So even though I believe the transaction advisor and the team will have a big role in all the environmental and social assessments, the government might have some role to try to de-risk the project before even the project goes into the pipeline. So I give an example of the IPP project now, the Selata project, which is tentatively selected at the site where the Ministry of Environment is planning to have it as a marine protected area. So this can be perceived by investors as a high risk. So just not underestimating, and we know that many projects have failed because they have not obtained their social license to operate or their environmental license to operate.
So what's your question?
The question is to see what's the perception of Mr. Hayek and how, because the Lebanese government has not been very strong in addressing those risks in their project procurement, and how will now PPP framework enhance that. And I very much welcome the law and the framework, and having international advisors coming in, they will help a lot, but the government has also some role they can play to de-risk the project before it actually enters into the PPP cycle.
Okay.
And my question is, we're very happy there are 3 projects on the pipeline, 2 quite advanced already, the third one moving on. Mr. Hayek, which projects you think would be the next in line? You have shown the table based on the country investment program. Which projects you think would be next in line? Thank you very much.
Which are the most advanced in your study or with your partners? Among these projects, what do you think will come next after the 3 ones?
Okay. First, thank you for your question about the environment. Very important. I have 3 comments on that. One is, under Lebanese law, you cannot undertake any project without having environmental impact assessment. So we have to do that, and we take it very seriously. Second, international financing entities will not finance unless you meet the Equator Principles conditions, and that has to, which is excellent, because then by doing this PPP and by doing it right and not cutting corners, we are ensuring that we are doing the right thing by our environment. And the third thing about that is you're right. I mean, the Lebanese government has to play a role in enforcing proper care for the environment, whether it is in the case of hazardous waste by obliging waste generators to comply, or whether it's a normal project that has to be supervised by the Ministry of Environment and ideally, if they pass legislation, if they agree a strategy for waste, for example, now it would be great. And the second part of your question, and I notice a lot of typos in this table, so I apologize for that. I can't believe this. But I think that I'm hoping that the hazardous waste would be the next one.
Okay.
But I think that we may be there competing with the Tripoli Special Economic Zone.
Okay.
The Triplo Special Economic Zone.
Yeah.
And
who decides? Who decides the priorities? What to do next, or what next? Who decides that?
It's a very good question. We've been asked that a lot at the SEDR conference. The thing is that when we are dealing with infrastructure in Lebanon, we are so deficient in our infrastructure that almost it doesn't matter. يعني كيف ما ضربت إيدك بيمشي الحال. So we are so deficient that really what we're doing is we're taking the projects as they mature, as their studies are done and completed, we are working on them at this stage.
Thank you so much for everyone, for the audience, for the guest speakers. Really, it was very helpful, Mr. Hayek, Mrs. Qadi, Mrs. Moushi, Mr. Hussein Shaitu. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really nice.
Here's a gift.
Thank you. Bye.
Most welcome.